My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 79 years old. For most of my life, I believed that family was the one thing you could count on when everything else fell apart. Neighbors move, friends drift, jobs vanish, and even health fails. But family, I thought, was the constant. Blood was supposed to bind us closer than anything else. That was the lie I carried like a candle in my chest, until the day my own daughter snuffed it out with a single sentence. It was a Sunday afternoon, late summer, the kind of day where the air outside smells of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. Inside my daughter's kitchen, though, it smelled of something sour, leftovers reheated one too many times. She slid a chipped plate across the counter to me, a lump of congealed macaroni sliding to one side, a dry chicken thigh clinging to the other. I looked down at the plate, then back up at her, expecting maybe a smile, a laugh, something that told me this was a joke. But her face was hard, cold. "You should be grateful for leftovers," she said flatly, as if she were reciting a fact and not tearing into my heart. "Nursing homes were made for people like you. At least here you're still in your own room." Her husband leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smirking like he was watching a bad sitcom. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was its own kind of cruelty. The room spun a little. My fingers trembled as they curled around the edge of the counter. I wanted to ask her if she remembered who nursed her through scarlet fever when she was 8, who worked double shifts just to buy her the pink dress she wore to prom. I wanted to remind her of the mother who stood in the pouring rain waiting for her bus to come back from college, the mother who cheered the loudest when she got her first teaching job. But all that stayed locked in my throat. Instead, I lowered myself into the chair by the window, staring down at the plate of scraps like it was evidence in a trial I never agreed to. My chest ached in that deep, hollow way that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with betrayal. "Eat," she said briskly, pulling open the refrigerator to shove in a carton of milk. "We don't waste food in this house." That sentence, "we don't waste food in this house," hit me like another slap. I had lived in this house. I had paid for the down payment when she and her husband couldn't qualify for the loan. My signature was still on the deed, even though they both pretended otherwise. I had worked, saved, and sacrificed for decades, only to be reduced to a mouth they didn't want to feed. I took a bite of the cold macaroni. Tasted like chalk. My eyes blurred as I watched the garden outside sway in the sunlight. A memory flickered. My daughter as a toddler, chubby hands reaching up to me, eyes wide with trust. How had we traveled from there to here? Her husband chuckled, low and mocking. "You know," he said, sipping his beer, "nursing homes take care of all this. Meals, meds, diapers. Would save us the trouble." I froze, fork clattering against the plate. I turned to my daughter, searching her face for outrage, for denial, for anything. But she just pressed her lips into a thin line and didn't look at me. She didn't defend me. She didn't stop him. It was as if I had ceased to be her mother and become a weight dragging her life down. The chair beneath me suddenly felt like quicksand, pulling me into a darkness I wasn't ready to face. My heart pounded, my stomach twisted, and for a long moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my 79 years. I sat there quietly, but inside something cracked. Not loud, not obvious, no explosion or scream. Just a hairline fracture deep in my chest, the kind that widens slowly until the whole structure collapses. And as I stared at my daughter's back, watching her shoulders tense as she scrubbed a perfectly clean counter, I realized something terrible. This was not the beginning of her cruelty. It was the culmination. I just hadn't been willing to see it before. The sound of my fork scraping the plate echoed like a verdict. I didn't know it then, but that day, the day my daughter told me I should be grateful for leftovers, was the day everything changed. It was the day I stopped being blind. And the day I quietly began keeping score. That night, alone in the dark of my room, I pulled open the bottom drawer of my dresser and slid out the old folder no one remembered existed, the folder that held the one truth my daughter had forgotten. And that truth would one day ruin her. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. I lay awake that night, the words still echoing in my skull like a cruel nursery rhyme. Grateful for leftovers. Nursing homes were made for people like me. At 79, sleep comes easy when you're tired in the bones, but that night, it refused me. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster, and thought about the bigger cracks in my life that had been forming long before today. It wasn't always like this with my daughter, Rachel. When she was little, she clung to my legs every morning before school, always begging for just one more hug. I remember braiding her hair, the silky strands sliding through my fingers, and listening to her chatter about the worlds she created in her head. She used to say she wanted to be a teacher because I had taught her how to read before she turned 5. And when she did become a teacher, I cried in the audience as if the diploma in her hand was mine too. Because in some ways it was. I had worked double shifts at the hospital laundry, steam pressing other people's sheets, sweating through endless loads, all so she could stay in school. Back then Rachel had soft eyes. She used to kiss my cheek and whisper, "Thank you, Mom. I'll never forget what you've done for me." But memory is a fragile thing. And gratitude, I've learned, has a short shelf life. The cracks began after she married David. David, my son-in-law, was the kind of man who measured worth in dollars. He never said it outright at first, but you could feel it in the way he sized you up when you walked into the room. To him, kindness was weakness, and weakness was something to exploit. When Rachel first brought him home for dinner, I tried to ignore the way he glanced around my modest living room like he was cataloging its value for a yard sale. I told myself love changes people. But it wasn't Rachel changing him, it was him changing Rachel. Slowly, she stopped calling just to say hello. Slowly, the thank yous turned into complaints. If I brought over food, she'd point out it was too salty. If I offered to babysit, she'd say the kids didn't need me hovering. If I bought the children clothes, she'd criticize the colors, the patterns, the price. First, I brushed it off. That's what mothers do, we excuse. We tell ourselves our children are stressed, tired, distracted. We pretend the cracks aren't there. But they were. And they were widening. I remember one Thanksgiving when David carved the turkey and Rachel passed around the sides. I reached for the mashed potatoes, and Rachel swatted my hand lightly. "Wait until everyone else has some, Mom," she said, smiling, but her voice was sharp enough to cut. Everyone laughed awkwardly, and I sat back, cheeks burning. It was a small moment, easily dismissed. But it stuck with me. Another time, when Rachel's youngest had a school play, I asked if she wanted me to come early and help with the costumes. She smiled thinly. "We've got it handled, Mom. You just sit in the back and clap when it's over." I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But deep down I knew. I kept hoping David was the poison, and Rachel was still my daughter underneath it all. But over time she began to sound like him, look at me the way he did, with that mix of pity and irritation. The woman who once clung to my legs now barely touched me at all. The breaking point came slowly, in whispers and glances, in forgotten birthdays and unreturned calls. And each time I swallowed it, told myself family is family, told myself I was overreacting. Until that Sunday. Until the plate of leftovers. Until the words that stripped me bare in my own daughter's kitchen. But lying awake that night, I realized something else. Something Rachel had forgotten. She thought I was powerless. She thought she held all the cards because I was old, because my body ached, because my hands shook when I held my teacup. But she had forgotten that every brick in this house had been paid for by me. Every bill that mattered had once been written with my signature. And in the bottom drawer of my dresser was a folder filled with documents, receipts, and legal papers that she hadn't bothered to look at in years. My lips curled into the faintest smile as the moonlight spilled across the floor. She thought I was at her mercy. But mercy was not what I was planning. The day would come when Rachel and David would learn exactly who still paid the bills. And when that day came, they wouldn't just regret the leftovers. They would regret ever crossing me. The next morning I heard Rachel and David whispering in the kitchen, their voices sharp and urgent. My name was in their mouths. I pressed my ear to the doorframe, heart racing. And that's when I heard it. David's voice, low and decisive. It's time we start looking into nursing homes. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The morning after I overheard David's words, I moved through the house like a ghost. My hands shook as I folded the quilt at the end of my bed, each corner tucking into place like a soldier preparing for battle. On the surface I was calm. Inside my chest was a storm. I made my way to the kitchen, the smell of coffee already brewing. Rachel was standing by the sink, mug in hand, staring out at the garden. David sat at the table, scrolling on his phone, lips pursed in that smug little smirk he always wore when he thought he was being clever. I poured myself a cup, sat at the far end of the table, and let the silence thicken between us. Rachel broke it first. "Mom," she said, not looking at me. "David and I have been talking." My stomach twisted, though I already knew where this was going. "We just think," she continued, pausing to sip her coffee, "it might be time to start thinking about alternatives." Alternatives. I repeated, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. David set his phone down, leaning forward. "Nursing homes, Margaret. Good ones. Places with professionals. You'd be cared for around the clock." The way he said my name, Margaret, not mom, not mother, felt like a blade. Rachel nodded quickly, as though agreeing made it less cruel. "You'd have people your age around. Activities. Doctors right there. It could be nice." I stared at them both, the two people who ate meals off plates I had bought, who lived under a roof I had helped pay for, who tucked their children into beds I once chose. My throat closed. "You want to send me away," I whispered. David's smile didn't falter. "We want what's best for everyone." Everyone. Not me. Their comfort. Their convenience. Rachel finally turned to face me, her expression tight. "Mom, you can't expect to just live here forever. We have our own lives, our own needs. We've done our best." "Your best." The words burst out of me before I could stop them. My voice cracked, but I kept going, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. "I gave up everything for you. My time, my money, my health. And now you think I'm what? A burden you can dump like trash." Her lips thinned into a sharp line. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." David stood, pushing his chair back with a screech. "This isn't up for debate. We'll find a place. You'll adjust." The room swayed. My chest heaved, my vision blurred. I gripped the table for balance, every bone in my body trembling. "Adjust." I spat the word out like poison. "To being abandoned by my own child." Rachel's face hardened. "You should be grateful we're even considering this. Some people don't have family at all." Grateful. Again with that word. It hit me then like a cruel revelation. She didn't just want me gone, she wanted me erased. To clear me from the picture of her perfect life. To tuck me away where no one would see the way she treated her own mother. I felt something inside me collapse. I stood slowly, my legs weak, my body aching in protest. My hand brushed the edge of the counter as I steadied myself. For a moment I thought I might fall right there on the linoleum. Rachel sighed, as if my pain was an inconvenience. "Mom, please. Don't make a scene." Scene. That's what she thought this was. Not my life. Not my dignity. Scene. I shuffled back toward my room, each step heavy, dragging. My breath came shallow, uneven. When I reached the door, I closed it quietly behind me, pressing my back to the wood as sobs shook me to my core. For the first time in my life, I felt truly unwanted. Not just overlooked or taken for granted, unwanted. I slid down to the floor, curling into myself like a child, and wept until my throat was raw. My tears dripped onto the carpet, dark stains blooming beneath my shaking hands. All I had ever wanted was to be loved. Matter. And now, in this house that carried my sacrifices in every brick and nail, I was nothing more than a mouth they wanted to shut, a body they wanted to move out of sight. I don't know how long I stayed there, crumpled against the door. Minutes, hours, it blurred together. But eventually the tears dried, leaving behind only a hollow ache. I was at my lowest, stripped of pride, of dignity, of hope. And yet, somewhere deep in the hollow, a flicker remained. A tiny flame, stubborn and alive. I thought of the folder in my drawer, the one I had pulled out the night before. The deeds, the receipts, the signatures, the proof. My daughter and her smug husband thought they held all the power. They thought they could erase me. But they had no idea what I still had tucked away. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, I sat at my desk under the pale glow of a lamp, the folder spread open before me. My eyes scanned the documents, my hand trembling not with weakness, but with resolve. And as I traced my finger over the final page, one thought settled in my mind with icy clarity. They wanted me gone. But it was I who would decide who stayed. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? I didn't sleep that night. Not even a wink. The folder lay open on the desk, its yellowed papers spread like weapons in an arsenal. My fingers traced the signatures. My name, bold and unwavering despite the decades that had passed. Mortgage statements, deed transfers, receipts for down payments. Every one of them a reminder of what Rachel and David had conveniently forgotten. This house, this land, this roof above their heads, it was mine. They lived in it like squatters dressed in family's clothing, eating from my cupboards, walking on my floors, raising their children in the shelter of my sacrifice. And yet, they had dared to serve me scraps and plot my exile. No more. For 79 years I had been the one to bend, to excuse, to forgive. But now I would be the one to break them. I gathered the documents into neat piles, clipped them tight, and slid them into a leather briefcase I hadn't used in years. My heart pounded with every motion, not from fear but from something sharper, anticipation. By dawn I was already dressed. A pressed blouse, black slacks, the pearl earrings Samuel had given me on our 15th anniversary. Dignity still mattered. If I was going to war, I wouldn't do it in my nightgown. I walked past the kitchen where Rachel was clattering pans, David sitting smugly with his newspaper. They barely glanced at me. To them I was already a shadow, half gone. Going somewhere? Rachel asked without looking up. Yes, I said, steady. Appointments. She didn't ask what kind. Didn't care. That was her mistake. The bus ride into town rattled my bones, but I didn't mind. Each bump, each lurch of the engine reminded me I was still moving, still in control. When the courthouse came into view, a weight lifted from my chest. Inside I asked for property records. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, clicked through his computer and handed me a stack of papers. My name glared up at me from every page. Rachel and David had assumed time and neglect had buried the truth. But truth doesn't die just because people ignore it. Next, I visited my lawyer, an old friend of Samuel's, a man named Henry who had handled our affairs for years. His hair was thinner, his hands slower, but his mind was still sharp. He studied the folder with a frown. "Margaret," he said finally, "you still hold majority ownership of the house. Legally, they can't make a single move without your consent." The words were like oxygen to my lungs. I leaned forward. "Henry, I don't just want to stop them from throwing me out. I want them to feel it. I want them to know what it's like to be powerless." He hesitated. "Revenge is a dangerous road." I met his eyes. So is betrayal. He didn't argue after that. Instead, he outlined my options, tightening my control over the property, freezing their access to accounts they thought were theirs, filing for breach of trust. My pen scratched across the pages as we drew up the papers. By the time I left his office, the plan had form. Still, doubts clawed at me. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the passing streets, my reflection faint in the glass. I was 79. My body ached. My hands trembled. Could I really pull this off? But then I remembered Rachel's voice, sharp, dismissive, telling me to be grateful for scraps. I remembered David's smirk when he said nursing homes would save them the trouble. My jaw clenched. Could. The next days were spent quietly, carefully. I acted as though nothing had changed, sitting at the table, eating whatever scraps they gave me, smiling faintly when spoken to. I was the obedient shadow, the silent old woman in the corner. And while they ignored me, I made my moves. I met Henry again, signed papers, shifted accounts, planted seeds that would soon grow into thorns too sharp for them to handle. And at night, alone in my room, I rehearsed the words I would say when the time came to strike. The beauty of revenge, I realized, wasn't in the secrecy. It was in the reveal. When you watch the ones who thought they held power crumble under the weight of truth, that's when justice tastes sweetest. And so I waited. I waited until the trap was ready. Until every paper was signed, every loophole closed, every thread tied. And then, one evening as Rachel and David sat in the living room sipping wine, I stepped quietly into the doorway, my briefcase in hand, my heart steady as a drum. They looked up at me, irritation flashing across Rachel's face. "What is it, Mom? Can't it wait?" I smiled slow and cold. "No," I said. "It can't." I placed the briefcase on the coffee table and snapped it open, the documents spilling into neat stacks. Rachel frowned, David leaned forward, and both of them froze as they saw whose name was on every page. And in that frozen silence, I said the words that would change everything. "You've forgotten who pays the bills." Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The briefcase snapped open like a judge's gavel. Rachel's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. David leaned forward, his smugness slipping as his eyes scanned the papers. Their silence was music to me, every second of it sweeter than any lullaby I'd sung to Rachel as a child. "Mom, what is this?" Rachel asked finally, her voice tight. I slid one document across the table with a steady hand. "The deed. Notice the name. Not yours. Not David's. Mine." David snorted, but it sounded forced. "That was decades ago. This house still belongs to me," I cut in sharply. "You've been living here on my mercy. And mercy," I let the word linger like smoke, "is something you've run out of." Rachel's face went pale. She flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling now, every paper whispering the same truth she'd tried to bury. "Mom, why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice rising. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. "Because you told me I should be grateful for scraps. Because you plotted to send me to a nursing home while sipping wine under my roof. Because you forgot who made this life possible for you." David slammed his palm against the table. "You can't just throw us out." My lips curled into a thin smile. "I can. And I will." The next morning, I filed the papers Henry had prepared. Ownership rights secured. Eviction notices drafted. Their world, so carefully built on my silence, began to crumble. Rachel screamed at me, tears streaking her face as she begged. "You can't do this, Mom. We have children." I looked her dead in the eye. "You should have thought of that before you treated me like garbage in my own home." David tried threats, shouting about lawyers, about fighting back. But when the sheriff's deputy came to serve the notice, it was my name on the line, not his. They had no ground to stand on, no claim. Within weeks, the day arrived. Their suitcases sat on the porch, stuffed in a rush of desperation. The children clung to their parents, confused and crying, as Rachel begged one last time. "Mom, please. Just think about what you're doing." I stood tall in the doorway, my cane in one hand, the eviction papers in the other. "I have thought about it. Every night. Every time you scraped leftovers onto my plate. Every time you whispered about nursing homes. Every time you forgot I was the one who built this life for you." Rachel sobbed. David glared. "Nay." Closed the door. The sound of that lock clicking shut was the sweetest revenge I'd ever known. But I wasn't finished. The next week, I invited the entire neighborhood into my living room. Not for a party, not for cake or celebration, but for the truth. I laid the documents out on the coffee table, explaining calmly how my own daughter and her husband had tried to erase me, to ship me off while living off my name. Gasps filled the room. Whispers spread like wildfire. Rachel and David returned that evening to find half the town knew their secret. The shame on Rachel's face was worse than tears, worse than anger. It was the collapse of her carefully crafted image, the perfect daughter, the loving family woman. Now everyone knew the truth. She was a parasite who tried to throw away her own mother. And as they walked past me, heads down, neighbors' eyes drilling holes into their backs, I felt no pity, only justice. The aftermath was brutal. Rachel's friends stopped calling. Parents at her school avoided her in the pickup line. David's business clients dropped him one by one. Their life unraveled, thread by thread, until they were left standing in the ruins. Meanwhile, I sat in the house I had built, sipping tea by the window. Alone, yes, but respected. Free. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, I thought back to that plate of leftovers. The dry chicken, the congealed macaroni. I remembered Rachel's voice, telling me to be grateful. And I smiled. Because in the end, it was she who was left with scraps. And that's how the daughter who once told me to be grateful for leftovers ended up with nothing but scraps of her own. I didn't forgive. I didn't forget. I took back what was mine, and I showed the world who really paid the bills. If you want more stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice served cold, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next one.